In 1881, the U.S. Army court-martialed its first black West Point graduate. The court found him innocent of the main crime, then destroyed his career anyway. This is the story of the 117-year-long fight to clear his name. Henry Ossian Flipper entered this world on March 21, 1856, in Thomasville, Georgia, as property. His mother Isabella and father Festus were enslaved, owned by different masters. When Festus's enslaver decided to relocate to Atlanta, the Flipper family faced separation. Festus Flipper, a skilled shoemaker, used every penny he'd saved to beg his master to purchase his wife and son. The master agreed. The family stayed together. 9 years later, the Civil War ended and the Flippers walked into freedom. Young Henry could read, taught by an educated enslaved person when he was 8. In Atlanta, missionary schools opened their doors to formerly enslaved children. Henry devoured every lesson. In 1869, when Atlanta University opened, he became one of its first students. But Henry Flipper didn't dream of becoming a doctor or a teacher. He wanted something that seemed impossible for a black man in 1873. He wanted to be an army officer. In January of that year, Flipper wrote to newly elected Georgia Congressman James Freeman requesting an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Freeman's response was cautious. He would recommend Flipper if he proved worthy and qualified. After an exchange of letters and examinations, Freeman made the nomination. On May 20th, 1873, Henry Flipper stood before the gates of West Point. He was 17 years old. In his autobiography, he described that moment with brutal honesty. With my mind full of the horrors of the treatment of all former cadets of color and the dread of inevitable ostracism, I approached tremblingly yet confidently. He had reason to tremble. He was the 5th black man appointed to West Point. He was the 3rd to actually be admitted. Not one had graduated. The treatment began immediately. In less than a month, they learned to call me nigger, Flipper wrote. His white classmates practiced something called silencing. They would not speak to him except when military regulations absolutely required it. He could not join them at meals, could not participate in social activities, could not make friends. For 4 years, Henry Flipper lived in almost total isolation, surrounded by hundreds of young men his own age who treated him as invisible. He roomed initially with James Webster Smith, the first black cadet admitted to West Point. Smith warned him what to expect, but Smith wouldn't make it. In his senior year, Smith was deemed deficient in philosophy and dismissed. Unlike white cadets who failed exams, he was never given a chance to retake it. After Smith's dismissal, Flipper had a room to himself for the remainder of his time at West Point. There was no society for me to enjoy, Flipper wrote. No friends, male or female, for me to visit, or with whom I could have any social intercourse. So absolute was my isolation. Between October 1875 and May 1876, he didn't speak to a single woman. The loneliness was crushing. Yet somehow, Henry Flipper persevered. His academic performance was above average. He excelled in engineering, law, French, and Spanish. When he wanted to quit, which was often, the commandant of cadets, Colonel Emory Upton, counseled him to stay. Some of the officers, if not the cadets, recognized something special in this young man. On June 14th, 1877, graduation day arrived. Henry Flipper ranked 50th in a class of 76. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma from General William Tecumseh Sherman, something unprecedented happened. The crowd of spectators erupted in applause. He was the only cadet that day to receive such recognition. The New York Times reported, "When Mr. Flipper, the colored cadet, stepped forward and received the reward of 4 years of as hard work and unflinching courage as any young man can be called upon to go through, the crowd of spectators gave him a round of applause." Second Lieutenant Henry Ossian Flipper had done what no black man in American history had done before. He'd graduated from West Point. He'd earned the right to be called an officer in the United States Army. He'd become the first black commissioned officer in the regular army. The celebration was brief. Flipper was assigned to the 10th United States Cavalry, one of two all-black cavalry regiments formed after the Civil War. The Buffalo Soldiers, as Native Americans called them, had earned a reputation for courage and competence on the frontier. These segregated units were commanded by white officers. Henry Flipper would be the first non-white officer to lead Buffalo Soldiers in the field. His first posting was Fort Sill, in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Unlike West Point, Fort Sill would showcase Flipper's talent. He surveyed and supervised construction of a road from Fort Sill to Gainesville, Texas. He installed telegraph lines from Fort Elliott to Fort Supply. Most impressively, he engineered a drainage system to eliminate stagnant ponds that bred malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The system worked brilliantly. It's still called Flipper's Ditch today. In 1977, it was designated a National Historic Landmark and Black Military Heritage Site. It remains in use. In October 1877, Flipper transferred to Fort Concho, Texas, joining a troop of the 10th Cavalry under Captain Nicholas Nolan. Nolan, an Irish immigrant and career soldier, would become crucial to Flipper's story. Unlike most white officers, Nolan didn't see Flipper's race first. He saw his competence. He made Flipper his adjutant, a position of trust traditionally given only to white officers. When Nolan married Anne Eleanor Dwyer in San Antonio in August 1878, he invited Flipper to board with his family. Flipper was welcomed at their dinner table. He spent time with Nolan's stepdaughter Kate, and when Anne's sister Molly Dwyer arrived at Fort Elliott in early 1879, he became friends with her too. Molly Dwyer and Henry Flipper went horseback riding together. On Sundays, they joined other officers and their families chasing coyotes and jackrabbits across the plains. They exchanged letters. Their friendship was innocent, by all accounts, but it was also something else in 1879 Texas. It was unacceptable. White officers at the fort were scandalized. A black man socializing with a white woman violated every racial code they held sacred. The rumors began immediately. Letters circulated hinting at improprieties. Jealous whispers suggested something inappropriate was happening. Captain Nolan, who saw nothing wrong with the friendship, defended Flipper. He praised Flipper's work in official reports, but a smear campaign had begun that would follow Flipper for years. In November 1880, Flipper arrived at Fort Davis, Texas, and was assigned duties as acting assistant quartermaster and acting commissary of subsistence. He was responsible for procuring and distributing food, maintaining careful financial records, and accounting for government funds. It was complex work requiring meticulous bookkeeping. Flipper had no previous experience in military finance, but he was an officer, and officers followed orders. Everything changed in March 1881 when Colonel William Rufus Shafter arrived to take command of Fort Davis. Shafter had a reputation. He was known as a strict disciplinarian who harassed officers he disliked. He tolerated black enlisted soldiers because the army required it, but he hated the very idea of a black officer. Within days of arriving, Shafter relieved Flipper as quartermaster without cause. Then Shafter did something peculiar. He asked Flipper to keep the commissary safe in his personal quarters. In the military, when a superior officer asks you to do something, it's not actually a question. Flipper complied. There was no truly secure place at Fort Davis to store commissary funds, and Shafter knew this. Flipper kept the money in his personal trunk. On July 8, 1881, Shafter ordered a special audit. Flipper discovered $1,440.43 was missing. He panicked. He'd seen Lieutenant Louis Wilhelmi prowling around his quarters at odd hours. He suspected Wilhelmi and possibly Lucy Smith, his housekeeper and cook who had access to his room, had taken it. But Flipper knew that if he reported the missing money to Shafter, his career was finished. Fair or not, he would be blamed. So Henry Flipper made a catastrophic decision. He tried to cover it up. He balanced his books with a personal check, counting on royalties from his published West Point autobiography to cover the amount. The publisher failed to deposit the money in time. The check bounced. Flipper, desperate, began submitting false reports to hide the discrepancy while scrambling to replace the funds. On August 13th, Colonel Shafter ordered Wilhelmi and another officer to search Flipper's quarters. They seized his ledger and funds from the trunk. They arrested him immediately and recommended a court-martial. Word spread through Fort Davis and the surrounding community. The local residents, who admired Flipper for his competence and character, took up a collection. Within 4 days, they'd raised the entire missing amount. Shafter hinted that if full restitution was made, he might drop the charges. The money was repaid in full by August 17th. Shafter pressed charges anyway. Flipper was released from the guardhouse but confined to his quarters, which were barricaded, nailed shut, and made as secure as the guardhouse itself. An armed guard stood watch day and night. While Flipper was in the guardhouse, his quarters were thoroughly searched again. Personal items were seized, including letters from Molly Dwyer. The court-martial convened on September 15, 1881, in the Post Chapel at Fort Davis. It was then suspended until November 1st to allow Flipper time to find legal representation. Flipper looked as far as Boston and New York. He contacted black lawyers. He contacted white lawyers. Almost no one was interested in defending a black officer accused of embezzling government funds. At the last minute, Captain Merritt Barber of the 16th Infantry volunteered. Barber was white. He was also convinced that Flipper was the victim of a conspiracy. The charges were twofold. First, embezzlement of $3,791.77 in commissary funds. Second, conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Flipper faced a 10-member court-martial board. 3 of those officers worked directly under Colonel Shafter. All were white. The prosecutor was Judge Advocate John W. Clowes. Captain Barber mounted an aggressive defense. On the embezzlement charge, he argued that under military law, the prosecution had to prove intentional, wrongful, and willful conversion of public money to his own use and benefit. No such evidence existed. None. The prosecution couldn't show that Flipper had spent any of the missing money on himself. They couldn't demonstrate personal enrichment. At most, Barber argued, Flipper was guilty of poor bookkeeping and inadequate security measures. Barber pointed out that Flipper had expected a check for $2,500 from his publisher. This proved he'd always intended to repay the money. He noted that local citizens, impressed by Flipper's character, had raised the full amount within days. He demonstrated that Shafter had contradicted himself multiple times in testimony. Most damningly, Barber revealed that Shafter had found $2,800 in commissary checks in the possession of Lucy Smith, Flipper's white housekeeper. This fact was never mentioned during the investigation. The implications were obvious. If Smith had access to commissary checks, she likely had access to commissary funds. On the embezzlement charge, Captain Barber's defense was overwhelming. The court had no choice. They acquitted Flipper of embezzlement. But during the lengthy proceedings, a second charge took center stage: conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. This charge involved Flipper's attempts to conceal the missing money. He'd written a check on insufficient funds. He'd lied to his commanding officer about the discrepancy. He'd signed false financial reports. All of this was true. Flipper admitted it. But Barber argued extenuating circumstances. The false check? Flipper never tried to use it in any transaction. He'd only displayed it to Shafter to buy time. The lies to his superior? Shafter had given him no guidance, no support, and had created an impossible situation by ordering Flipper to keep funds in his personal quarters without proper security. The false reports? They were a misguided attempt by a young officer to maintain his professional reputation while correcting an accounting error. Barber referenced 2 recent court-martials where white officers were charged with conduct unbecoming. In both cases, the officers were acquitted on grounds that their actions hadn't been prejudicial to good order and military discipline. The same standard should apply to Flipper, Barber argued. Then the prosecution played its final card. They introduced the letters between Flipper and Molly Dwyer. The letters themselves contained nothing improper, but their existence was damning. A black man and a white woman exchanging personal correspondence violated the racial order that white officers considered sacred. Relationships between black men and white women were, in their view, strictly forbidden. The court deliberated. In December 1881, they announced their verdict: not guilty of embezzlement, guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. The sentence was automatic under military regulations. Dismissal from the service of the United States. It was more than harsh. It was unprecedented. Captain Barber immediately filed documentation showing that 2 white officers had recently been convicted of actual embezzlement. Neither had been dismissed. Neither had been dishonored. Both remained in the Army. The Judge Advocate General, the Army's chief legal officer, reviewed the case. He concluded that Flipper's conviction was racially motivated. He recommended a punishment other than dismissal. At that time, court-martial sentences required presidential approval. Flipper's case passed through military channels to President Chester Arthur. Family members, supporters, and prominent citizens petitioned for clemency. The evidence of racial bias was overwhelming. The disparity in sentencing compared to white officers was undeniable. President Arthur approved the court's sentence without modification. On June 30th, 1882, Second Lieutenant Henry Ossian Flipper was drummed out of the United States Army with a dismissal, the officer equivalent of a dishonorable discharge. He lost his commission. He lost his rank. He lost his military career. He lost everything he'd worked for since he was a boy, dreaming of West Point in post-war Atlanta. He sold his horses and traveled to El Paso, Texas, disgraced, unemployed, and effectively blacklisted from military service. But Henry Flipper refused to accept defeat. Over the next 58 years, he built a remarkable civilian career. He worked as a surveyor and civil engineer throughout the Southwest and Mexico. He became an expert on Spanish and Mexican land law, translating complex legal documents for the United States government. In 1895, the government published his translation of Spanish and Mexican Land Laws, New Spain and Mexico. He surveyed mining claims, worked as a special agent for the Justice Department, and served as an aide to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. In 1919, his fluency in Spanish earned him a position as interpreter and translator for a Senate subcommittee. In 1921, he became special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior, working with the Alaskan Engineering Commission. In 1923, William F. Buckley hired him as an engineer for the newly formed Pantepec Oil Company in Venezuela, where he worked until 1930. But through every success, every achievement, every new position, Henry Flipper carried one burden: the stain of his dishonorable discharge, the injustice of his court-martial. He never stopped fighting to clear his name. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, Flipper volunteered for military service. A bill was introduced in Congress to restore his rank. It died in committee. He tried again and again. In 1924, he made his final attempt. Another bill was introduced in the Senate. It too died quietly, buried by indifference. Henry Flipper died on May 3, 1940, in Atlanta, Georgia, at the age of 84. He was 58 years removed from that June morning at Fort Davis, when his Army career ended. He died without vindication. He died with that dishonorable discharge still attached to his name. For 36 years after his death, nothing changed. Then, in 1972, a Georgia schoolteacher named Ray McCall began researching Flipper's case at the urging of Flipper's niece, Ursula Flipper King. McCall uncovered the extent of racial bias in the court-martial. He documented the disparity in sentencing. He built an undeniable case that Henry Flipper had been railroaded. In 1976, Flipper's descendants and supporters applied to the Army Board for correction of military records. The board reviewed the evidence. They acknowledged that they lacked authority to overturn the court-martial conviction itself. But they reached a stunning conclusion. The conviction and punishment were unduly harsh and unjust. On December 13, 1976, the Army changed Flipper's discharge from dismissal to honorable discharge, effective June 30, 1882. After 94 years, Henry Flipper's military record was corrected. But correcting the record wasn't enough. In 1997, a private law firm, Arnold and Porter, filed an application for a presidential pardon on Flipper's behalf. The application moved through government channels. Typically, pardon applications were rejected if the intended recipient was deceased. The Justice Department had maintained this policy for decades. On February 19, 1999, President Bill Clinton signed the first posthumous presidential pardon in American history. Henry Ossian Flipper was fully and unconditionally pardoned of any wrongdoing. 117 years after he was drummed out of the army, Henry Flipper's name was finally completely cleared. Today, West Point honors the man it once isolated. In 1977, a bust of Lieutenant Flipper was unveiled at the Academy. The Henry O. Flipper Award is now presented annually to graduating cadets who demonstrate leadership, self-discipline, and perseverance in the face of unusual difficulties. It's one of the highest honors West Point bestows. The story of Henry Flipper's court-martial matters because it illuminates a larger truth about American history. This country has repeatedly asked black men and women to serve, to sacrifice, to prove themselves worthy of opportunities that white citizens receive without question. And when they do prove themselves, when they excel despite overwhelming obstacles, the system often punishes them for daring to succeed. Henry Flipper graduated from West Point despite 4 years of isolation and harassment. He served with distinction on the frontier. He engineered solutions to real problems that saved lives. He did everything the army asked of him, and more. His reward was to be set up by a racist commanding officer, convicted on a technicality, and dismissed with a punishment no white officer received for similar or worse offenses. The missing commissary funds that triggered Flipper's downfall amounted to roughly $1,440. The evidence suggests his housekeeper may have stolen them. Flipper's only real crime was attempting to hide the theft to avoid giving his enemies the ammunition they needed to destroy him. He knew they were looking for any excuse. He knew his race made him vulnerable. He knew the system was rigged against him. He was right on every count. Colonel Shafter got what he wanted, a black officer removed from his command. The white officers who found Flipper's friendship with Molly Dwyer intolerable got what they wanted, proof that black officers didn't belong. The racial order that demanded black men accept inferior status was reinforced, but they couldn't destroy what Henry Flipper built. His engineering works endure. His writings remain invaluable historical documents. His example inspired generations of black officers who followed. Between 1870 and 1935, only 3 black men graduated from West Point: Henry Flipper in 1877, John Hanks Alexander in 1887, and Charles Young in 1891, 1,889. The fourth wouldn't come until 1936, when Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. graduated and went on to command the Tuskegee Airmen. Each of these men endured the same silencing, the same isolation, the same systematic attempts to break them. Some, like Davis, faced formal investigations designed to force them out. The system's hostility to black excellence was relentless. Henry Flipper spent 58 years fighting to clear his name. He died before achieving vindication. But his fight wasn't wasted. It taught us that injustice deferred is still injustice. That wrongs don't become right simply because time passes. That America must reckon with how it has treated those who served despite being unwanted. The court-martial of Lieutenant Henry Flipper in 1881 was not about missing commissary funds. It was about a nation unwilling to accept that a black man could be an officer and a gentleman. About white supremacy enforcing its boundaries through military law. About courage confronting a system designed to crush it. In the end, Henry Flipper won, not in his lifetime, but in legacy. The first black West Point graduate became a symbol of perseverance against impossible odds. The disgraced lieutenant became an honored pioneer. The victim of injustice became a testament to the long arc bending toward justice. On that June morning in 1882, they took his uniform and his rank. They thought they'd taken everything that mattered. They were wrong. Henry Flipper's real legacy wasn't his commission. It was proving that excellence cannot be destroyed by prejudice, that truth eventually surfaces despite attempts to bury it, and that one person's courage to fight for justice, even after death, can change how a nation remembers its past. Lieutenant Henry Ossian Flipper graduated from West Point on June 14, 1877. He was dismissed from the army on June 30th, 1882. He was pardoned by the President of the United States on February 19th, 1999. Justice delayed is justice denied. But sometimes, even after death, justice arrives. And when it does, it demands we remember why it took so long.